At 30,000 feet in the air, a pregnant woman collapsed in the middle of first class, gasping for air, and there wasn't a single doctor on board. As panic spread through the cabin, no one paid attention to the 17-year-old black boy in a worn-out hoodie sitting back in economy. But just minutes later, he would be the one to save both the mother and her unborn child. And when the billionaire husband asked what he wanted in return, the boy's answer brought him to his knees in tears. This is their story. If you're enjoying this journey, make sure to subscribe so you never miss our powerful true stories of unexpected connections that change lives forever. 8 hours earlier, Richard Harrington stepped out of the gleaming black Bentley onto the rain-slicked pavement outside JFK's International Terminal, his Italian leather shoes worth more than what many people earned in a week. At 58, he carried himself with the easy confidence of a man who had built an empire from nothing, a man who expected doors to open when he approached them, and they always did. Today, however, all his wealth and influence felt hollow as he gently guided his wife, Catherine, from the car. "Easy now, sweetheart," he murmured, his arm protectively around her waist. At 43, Catherine Harrington was still breathtaking, her pregnancy giving her an ethereal glow that softened her normally sharp features. Her shoulder-length blonde hair framed a face that had graced charity gala photos in the society pages for years, but today, worry lines creased her forehead. "I'm fine, Richard," she insisted, though her hand rested protectively over her rounded belly. "Dr. Winters said it's perfectly safe to fly in the second trimester. The conference in London is important, and I want to be there when you receive your award." Richard nodded, but his eyes betrayed his concern. After 3 miscarriages and years of fertility treatments, this pregnancy was nothing short of miraculous. At 28 weeks, they were finally allowing themselves to hope. "First class all the way. Private car waiting in London. And we'll have the doctor on call," Richard recited, as much to reassure himself as his wife. "I've arranged for the flight attendants to know about your condition." Catherine rolled her eyes affectionately. "You've thought of everything, as always. That's why they're giving you that Humanitarian Financier of the Year award, isn't it?" As their driver unloaded their matching set of to-me luggage, neither noticed the yellow taxi that pulled up several cars behind them, or the lanky teenage boy who stepped out, shouldering a battered backpack and counting loose bills to pay the fare. Elijah Williams winced as he handed over nearly all his remaining cash to the taxi driver. The trip from his grandmother's apartment in Harlem to the airport had cost more than he'd anticipated. He tucked the remaining $20 bill into his worn wallet, emergency money his grandmother had insisted he take. "You're going to knock their socks off, baby," she had told him that morning, her gnarled hands straightening his collar with trembling fingers. At 73, Beatrice Williams was still the strongest person Elijah knew. Despite the oxygen tube that now accompanied her everywhere and the medications that ate up most of her fixed income. "Those doctors at that fancy program in London gonna see what I always seen in you." Elijah had simply nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. What he hadn't told his grandmother was that the Young Medical Achievers International Program had only provided a partial scholarship. The remainder, airfare, accommodations, meals, had come from years of saved birthday money, part-time jobs, and the small life insurance policy his mother had left when she'd passed from breast cancer 3 years earlier. This trip represented everything. His future, his dreams, his chance to eventually lift his grandmother out of their one-bedroom apartment with the unreliable heating and the landlord who never fixed the elevator that his grandmother could no longer navigate. As he entered the bustling terminal, Elijah pulled out the printed boarding pass and checked the departure gate. His heart raced with equal parts excitement and terror. He had never flown before, had never even left New York, yet in a few hours, he would be crossing the Atlantic to a medical program that accepted only 50 students worldwide. The letter of recommendation from his AP biology teacher had called him a once-in-a-generation talent, with an intuitive understanding of human physiology that cannot be taught. What his teacher didn't mention was how that understanding had been forged out of necessity, as Elijah had become his grandmother's primary caregiver, learning to monitor her COPD, recognize the early signs of her congestive heart failure episodes, and administer her complex medication regimen. By 16, he could take vital signs as skillfully as many nursing students and had memorized the contraindications of every medication in their small bathroom cabinet. Navigating through the crowded terminal, Elijah couldn't help noticing how people subtly shifted away as he approached, how security guards tracked him with their eyes, how mothers pulled their children slightly closer. He'd grown accustomed to it, this unconscious choreography of bias, but today it stung more than usual. Today was supposed to be about possibility, about being seen for his mind rather than his appearance. He was so lost in thought that he nearly collided with a luggage cart being pushed by a harried-looking airline employee. As he sidestepped, he caught sight of the couple he'd seen outside. The man in the expensive suit now guiding his pregnant wife toward the first-class check-in counter, the airline staff jumping to attention at their approach. Elijah watched for a moment before turning toward the much longer economy line, unaware that their paths would cross again in the most dramatic of circumstances. As they settled into the premium lounge, Richard Harrington scrolled through emails on his phone while Catherine leafed through a pregnancy magazine. The soft leather chairs and muted lighting created a cocoon of privilege, separating them from the bustle of the main terminal. "Braxton Hicks again," Catherine murmured, shifting uncomfortably and pressing a hand to her side. "They've been more frequent lately." Richard looked up immediately. "Should we call Dr. Winters?" Catherine smiled reassuringly. "It's perfectly normal, Richard. Remember what the birthing class instructor said? My body is just practicing." Nodding reluctantly, Richard returned to his emails, but his attention was divided. The Harrington Financial Group was finalizing their largest philanthropic initiative to date, a medical center in Rwanda that would serve thousands of underserved patients. It was this project that had earned him the humanitarian award, though Richard would never admit the private truth. The entire endeavor had begun as a tax strategy recommended by his financial advisors. What had started as a savvy business move had evolved into something more meaningful, especially after Catherine's involvement. She had thrown herself into the project with genuine passion, perhaps compensating for the emptiness of their childless home. "Mr. Harrington," a lounge attendant approached with deference, "we'll begin boarding your flight shortly. May I escort you and Mrs. Harrington to the gate?" As Richard nodded and helped Catherine to her feet, across the terminal Elijah was already queued in the long boarding line, reviewing medical terminology on flashcards he'd created himself. The worn edges testified to countless hours of study. "Pulmonary embolism," he whispered to himself. "Symptoms include sudden shortness of breath, chest pain, rapid heart rate." He flipped to the next card, unaware that this particular condition would become horrifyingly relevant in the hours to come. The boarding process emphasized the divide between their worlds. The Harringtons were welcomed aboard with deferential smiles, settled into spacious first-class pods with champagne for Richard and sparkling water for Catherine. Elijah shuffled down the narrow aisle of economy, squeezing past other passengers to find his middle seat, sandwiched between a heavy-set businessman who immediately claimed both armrests and an elderly woman already nodding off against the window. As the plane taxied and then launched into the darkening sky, none of them could have predicted how their carefully separated worlds were about to collide, or how assumptions and prejudices would soon be laid bare at 30,000 feet, where there was nowhere to hide and no one to call but each other. For hours into the transatlantic flight, with the sky outside having transitioned from dusk to complete darkness, most passengers had settled into the liminal space that long flights create, a suspension between departure and arrival, between one life and another. The cabin lights had been dimmed, the background hum of the engines a lullaby that had lulled many to sleep. Elijah remained awake, too keyed up about the interview that awaited him in London. He'd managed to negotiate a bathroom break past his now snoring seamates and was standing in the rear of the plane, stretching his long legs and reviewing his notes one more time by the soft glow of the galley lights. "You should try to get some sleep, honey," advised an older flight attendant as she organized a beverage cart. Her name tag read Gloria, and the crow's feet around her eyes crinkled kindly. "Still got a long flight ahead." "Yes, ma'am," Elijah replied with the reflexive politeness his grandmother had instilled in him. "Just a little nervous. First time flying." "Well, you picked a doozy for your first time, transatlantic," Gloria chuckled. "Where you headed?" "London. Got some family waiting." "No family, ma'am. I'm interviewing for a medical program for high school students interested in becoming doctors." Something in Gloria's expression shifted subtly, surprise, followed by a warm approval that Elijah rarely received from strangers. "Well now, that's something. My grandson's about your age, more interested in video games than anything else." A call light illuminated on her panel, cutting their conversation short. "Duty calls. First class probably wanting more champagne. Those folks up front, they don't sleep much either." She winked and pushed her cart forward. Elijah returned to his seat, carefully maneuvering past his still sleeping roommates. As he settled in, he couldn't help but wonder about the people in first class with their champagne and fully reclining seats. People like the elegant couple he'd seen at the airport. What did they worry about? Certainly not how to stretch $20 for 2 days in London while waiting for the program's meal stipend to kick in. In first class, Catherine Harrington shifted uncomfortably in her pod. Despite the spaciousness and the nearly flat reclined position, she couldn't find relief from the persistent ache in her lower back. She'd been experiencing occasional dizziness throughout the day, but had attributed it to the normal discomforts of pregnancy. Now, as she pressed a hand against her chest, she felt an unfamiliar tightness. "Richard," she whispered, not wanting to wake him if he'd finally fallen asleep. Her husband had been so vigilant, so worried throughout this pregnancy, that she'd found herself downplaying her discomfort to spare him additional anxiety. Richard stirred immediately, years of light sleep from business concerns making him instantly alert. "What is it? What's wrong?" "Probably nothing," Catherine said, trying to sound reassuring despite the growing pressure in her chest. "Just feeling a little breathless." Richard immediately pressed the call button, his face betraying the concern he tried to mask with a calm voice. "Let's have the flight attendant bring you some water. Dr. Winters said to stay hydrated." Gloria appeared moments later, her professional smile faltering slightly as she registered Catherine's pallor. "Mrs. Harrington, are you feeling all right?" "I'm fine, just—" Catherine paused, a sharper pain interrupting her words. Her hand flew to her chest. "Actually, I'm having trouble catching my breath." Gloria's expression turned serious. She reached for Catherine's wrist, checking her pulse with practiced efficiency. "How far along are you, Mrs. Harrington?" 28 weeks, Richard answered for her, his voice tight. "Is something wrong? Should we be concerned?" "I'm going to get our first aid kit and see if there's a doctor on board," Gloria said calmly, though her quickened pace betrayed her concern. "Just try to relax and take slow breaths, Mrs. Harrington." As Gloria moved swiftly through the cabin, making a discreet announcement requesting medical assistance, Catherine's condition deteriorated rapidly. Her breathing became more labored, a sheen of sweat breaking out across her forehead despite the cabin's cool temperature. "Richard," she gasped, genuine fear in her eyes, "something's wrong." "The baby," Richard clutched her hand, his composed exterior crumbling. "Help," he called out, his voice carrying through the hushed cabin. "My wife needs help." The commotion rippled through the plane, pulling drowsy passengers from their sleep. In economy, Elijah was jolted awake by the increasing murmurs and movement in the aisles. He heard snippets of worried conversation, pregnant woman, first class, breathing problems. A second flight attendant hurried past his row, carrying what looked like an emergency medical kit. "Is there a doctor on board?" she called out, scanning the faces in the economy cabin. After apparently finding no medical personnel in business or first class, Elijah felt a cold wave of recognition wash over him. The symptoms being described in hurried whispers around him: shortness of breath, chest pain, pregnancy triggered an alarm bell in his mind. His grandmother had experienced similar symptoms during a frightening episode the previous year, though without the pregnancy complication. The diagnosis had been a pulmonary embolism, a blood clot in the lungs. Pregnancy increased the risk significantly. He'd read that in one of his medical books. He hesitated, doubt holding him back. Who would listen to a teenager? What if he was wrong? But the continued calls for medical help and the escalating urgency in the flight attendants' voices propelled him to action. Standing up, Elijah raised his hand. "I'm not a doctor," he said, his voice steadier than he felt, "but I might know what's happening." The flight attendant barely glanced his way. "We need a medical professional, young man. Please stay seated." "It could be a pulmonary embolism," Elijah persisted, louder this time. "Pregnancy increases the risk by 5 times. Does she have swelling in one leg? Is she gasping between words?" This time the flight attendant paused, registering both his words and his youth with surprise. My grandmother had one last year. I helped care for her. She has COPD and heart failure." The words tumbled out as Elijah moved into the aisle. "If it is a PE, she needs oxygen immediately and possibly blood thinners. Do you have aspirin in the medical kit?" For a moment, the flight attendant seemed torn between protocol and the confident authority in the young man's voice. Then a more urgent call from the front of the plane made the decision for her. "Come with me," she said brusquely. "But if you're wrong, I pray I am," Elijah said, following her toward first class, acutely aware of the curious and skeptical gazes following him. The scene that greeted him in first class was chaos contained within luxury. Catherine Harrington lay reclined in her pod, her complexion ashen, her breathing shallow and rapid. Richard hovered beside her, his face a mask of helpless terror. Gloria was attempting to place an oxygen mask over Catherine's face, but the woman was becoming increasingly agitated, gasping that she couldn't breathe even with it. Richard looked up as Elijah approached, confusion and desperation warring in his expression. "Who's this? Where's the doctor?" "There's no doctor on board, sir," the flight attendant explained. "This young man says he might know what's happening." Richard's eyes narrowed, taking in Elijah's youth, his casual clothes, his race, making calculations and judgments as he'd been conditioned to do throughout his life in the upper echelons of finance. Under normal circumstances, he wouldn't have entrusted this boy with getting his coffee order right, let alone his wife's life. But these weren't normal circumstances. "What's wrong with my wife?" he demanded, his tone a complex mixture of authority and plea. Elijah swallowed, pushing down his awareness of the man's skepticism. "Sir, I think she might have a pulmonary embolism, a blood clot in her lungs. The symptoms match, and pregnancy increases the risk, especially during air travel." "And you know this how exactly?" Richard's voice was taut with suspicion. "I take care of my grandmother. She has similar health issues. I've been studying medicine since I was 12. Elijah moved closer to Catherine, addressing her directly with gentle authority. "Ma'am, do you have pain or swelling in one leg? Maybe started before the flight." Catherine nodded weakly, gesturing to her left calf. Since yesterday, she managed between labored breaths. "Thought it was normal pregnancy swelling." Elijah turned to Gloria. "We need to elevate her legs, give her oxygen, and if you have aspirin in the medical kit, she should take one. It's a blood thinner. Also check if there's any injectable blood thinners like heparin. Some advanced kits have them." Gloria exchanged glances with her colleague, then nodded decisively. "I'll check the kit. Emily, notify the captain. We may need to divert." Richard watched in stunned silence as the teenager gently helped reposition his wife, explaining each move with a calm confidence that seemed incongruous with his youth. "The clot probably formed in her leg," Elijah explained, gesturing to Catherine's swollen calf while maintaining eye contact with her to keep her focused and calm. "Sometimes they break loose and travel to the lungs. The aspirin will help prevent it from getting bigger while we get you to a hospital." "How do you know all this?" Richard asked again, but the accusatory edge had been replaced by something closer to wonder. Elijah finally looked up, meeting the older man's gaze directly. "Because I had to know. My grandmother, she depends on me." He turned back to Catherine. "The oxygen will help, Mrs. Harrington." Try to take slow, deep breaths if you can. In that suspended moment, as the plane continued its journey across the dark Atlantic and a wealthy businessman watched a black teenager he would have typically ignored potentially saving his wife's life, something shifted imperceptibly in the fabric of both their worlds. Neither could have articulated it yet, but in the artificial bubble of the aircraft cabin, the carefully constructed barriers of class, race, and assumption had begun to crack. The captain's voice came over the intercom, announcing they would be making an emergency landing in Iceland, the nearest location with adequate medical facilities. As the plane changed course, banking slightly northward, Catherine's breathing eased somewhat with the oxygen and aspirin, but her condition remained precarious. The baby, however, was showing signs of distress, its heartbeat racing, as detected by a portable fetal monitor in the emergency kit. Throughout the tense hour that followed, Elijah remained by Catherine's side, monitoring her vital signs with the limited equipment available and providing clear, constant updates to both Richard and the flight crew. His presence seemed to steady Catherine, whose panic had initially worsened her condition. "My grandmother always says panic uses oxygen we can't spare," he told her with a gentle smile. "So we're going to stay calm together, you and me and your baby." Richard, watching this interaction, struggled with a complex wash of emotions. Relief that someone seemed to know what to do battled with the uncomfortable realization that he had immediately discounted this young man based solely on appearance. As the minutes passed and his wife's condition stabilized somewhat under Elijah's care, gratitude began to overshadow everything else. "What's your name?" Richard asked finally, his voice rough with emotion. "Elijah. Elijah Williams, sir." "Thank you, Elijah," Richard said, the words inadequate for the weight he tried to convey. "I don't know what would have happened if—" "Don't thank me yet, sir," Elijah interrupted gently. "She needs proper medical care as soon as possible. The baby, too." He hesitated, then added, "I was supposed to be interviewing at the Young Medical Achievers program in London tomorrow morning. Guess that's not happening now." Something flickered across Richard's face, recognition, perhaps, of the sacrifices being made in this moment that extended beyond his own family crisis. But before he could respond, the plane began its descent toward Reykjavik, and all attention returned to preparing Catherine for the emergency landing and the medical team that would be waiting. As the wheels touched down on Icelandic soil, none of them could have predicted how the next 24 hours would unfold, or how a request made in a hospital waiting room would change the trajectory of all their lives. The fluorescent lights of Lance Badatali University Hospital cast a harsh glow over the waiting room, erasing the distinctions of class and privilege that had separated Richard Harrington from Elijah Williams just hours before. Both sat on identical, uncomfortable plastic chairs, an untouched cup of vending machine coffee cooling between Richard's manicured hands. Catherine had been rushed into emergency care immediately upon arrival, a team of doctors confirming Elijah's diagnosis of pulmonary embolism complicated by pregnancy. The medical staff had been impressed by the quick intervention on the plane, the lead doctor telling Richard that the aspirin and oxygen had likely prevented a much worse outcome. "The next 24 hours will be critical," the doctor had explained in accented but fluent English. "We have her on proper anticoagulants now, and we're monitoring the baby closely. She's stable, but not out of danger." Now, in the sterile limbo of the waiting room, Richard found himself studying the young man who sat several chairs away, fatigue evident in the slump of his shoulders. In the harsh hospital lighting, Elijah looked even younger than he had on the plane, barely more than a child, really. The sparse beginnings of facial hair and the adult confidence of his medical knowledge stood in contrast to the youth still present in his face. "You should get some rest," Richard said eventually, breaking the silence. "There's nothing more to be done tonight." Elijah looked up, shadows under his eyes. "I'm okay, sir. I'd like to know she's going to be all right." Richard nodded, a lump forming unexpectedly in his throat. This boy had no obligation to Catherine, no connection to either of them. Yet here he sat at 2 in the morning in a foreign country, having missed the opportunity he'd traveled so far to pursue. "Tell me about this program," Richard said. "The one in London." Elijah straightened slightly, a spark returning to his tired eyes. Young medical achievers. It's an international program for high school students planning medical careers. Only 50 students worldwide get accepted each year. His voice took on a quiet pride. The interviews are tomorrow. I mean today now. The program offers full scholarships to college for the top 10 participants. And you're missing it because of us? Richard stated flatly. Elijah shrugged, but the disappointment was evident beneath his attempt at nonchalance. Some things matter more. My grandmother would say the same. Richard fell silent again, turning the paper coffee cup in his hands. The mention of Elijah's grandmother triggered memories of the boy's earlier comments on the plane. You mentioned caring for your grandmother, Richard prompted after a moment, genuinely curious now. She has health problems, COPD, congestive heart failure, and arthritis that's getting worse. Elijah replied matter-of-factly, rather than seeking sympathy. Been taking care of her since my mom passed 3 years ago. Just the two of us now. Richard absorbed this information, mentally reconstructing his understanding of the young man before him. Not a boy really, despite his youth, someone who had shouldered adult responsibilities far earlier than most. And the medical knowledge, that's from caring for her? Elijah nodded. Had to learn fast. Our neighborhood doesn't have the best access to health care. When Mom got sick, breast cancer, I started reading everything I could find. After she died, I kept going. Grandma says I got a gift for it. A faint smile touched his lips. She works too hard to make sure I can keep studying. Takes in sewing, even with her arthritis. That's why this program mattered so much. Would have meant a full ride to medical school eventually. The matter-of-fact recitation of hardship, delivered without self-pity, struck Richard more forcefully than any emotional appeal could have. Here was a young man who had faced more adversity in 17 years than Richard had in his entire privileged life. Yet he sat in this sterile waiting room, concerned about a stranger's wife rather than his own derailed opportunity. I've been unfair to you, Richard admitted abruptly, the words surprising even himself. On the plane I saw, he stopped, uncomfortable with naming his own prejudice. I know what you saw, sir, Elijah said quietly, without accusation. I'm used to it. The simple statement hung in the air between them, an indictment more powerful for its resignation. Before Richard could respond, a doctor appeared at the waiting room entrance. Mr. Harrington, your wife is asking for you. The doctor consulted his clipboard. She's also asking for Elijah. Said he was the young man who helped her on the plane. Both rose immediately, following the doctor through the labyrinthine corridors. Catherine had been moved from emergency care to a private room, multiple monitors tracking her vital signs, and the baby's heartbeat providing a reassuring background rhythm. She looked pale against the white hospital sheets, but her breathing was clearly easier, the blue tint gone from her lips. Her eyes brightened as the two entered. My heroes, she said, her voice weak but warm. They told me what you did, Elijah. That you recognized what was happening when no one else could. Elijah ducked his head, suddenly shy in the face of her gratitude. Anyone with the same knowledge would have done the same, ma'am. But no one else had that knowledge, she insisted, reaching out a hand. After a moment's hesitation, Elijah stepped forward to take it. The doctor said without the quick intervention on the plane I might have. She stopped, her free hand moving protectively to her belly. Both of us might have been lost. Richard moved to her other side, bending to kiss her forehead. How are you feeling, sweetheart? Better. They say the clot is dissolving with the medication. The baby's heart rate has stabilized. She squeezed Elijah's hand before releasing it. Richard told me you missed your interview for a medical program because of our emergency. Elijah shifted uncomfortably. It's not important right now. It is important, Catherine insisted. Richard says it could have meant a scholarship. Your future. There will be other opportunities, Elijah said, though the slight tightening of his jaw suggested he didn't entirely believe it. Richard watched this exchange, a decision crystallizing in his mind. You should get some rest, he told Catherine. The doctor says you'll need to remain here for observation for at least 2 days. I've arranged for us to stay at a hotel nearby. He turned to Elijah. You too. The airline has provided accommodations for all the passengers while they arrange alternative flights. I've made sure you have a room as well. Thank you, sir, Elijah said, the formalities still firmly in place despite the intense circumstances they had shared. I should call my grandmother. Let her know what's happened. She'll be worried when I don't check in from London. As Elijah stepped out to make his call, Richard lingered by Catherine's bedside, an unfamiliar turmoil of thoughts churning within him. In the span of a few hours, his carefully ordered worldview had been disrupted by this chance encounter with a young man who defied every unconscious assumption he'd made. He's remarkable, Catherine murmured, reading his expression. So young, but so capable. And to think, if he hadn't been on that flight, she didn't complete the thought. Richard nodded, squeezing her hand. Get some sleep. I'll be right here. As Catherine drifted off, Richard found himself contemplating privilege, opportunity, and debt, not financial debt, which he understood intimately as the foundation of his business empire, but moral debt, the kind that couldn't be repaid with a simple thank you or even a generous check. Richard once believed that money could repay any debt, but the boy who saved his wife asked for nothing, not a dollar for himself. What Elijah requested instead left the billionaire speechless. And when Richard finally understood why, he couldn't hold back his tears. What kind of request could make one of the most powerful men on that plane completely reevaluate everything he thought he knew? Part 2 will challenge how you see kindness, privilege, and the true value of a simple thank you. Don't miss it. See you in the next video.